it's time to get started. Um, there's several people out of town, so we might just be a small crowd today. Already are, um, but that's okay. There's several of us here, and that counts for something. Let's pray, and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity we have to come together and study of your word. Be with those that are out of town right now, with Nicole and her family, and Dawn, and just any others who might be traveling at this time. Pray that they might return home safely and be back with us at the next time we gather together. Be with those who are sick at this time, and just ask that you bring them healing and comfort and strength, and help us to clear our minds of any concerns, so that we might be attentive to your word. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. Genesis chapter 42 is where we're going to spend our time today. Now, here in these closing chapters of Genesis that we're looking at, we are continuing to deal with the life of Jacob's favored son, Joseph. More specifically, as we reach this chapter, we begin to read about how over 2 decades of being apart, Joseph is finally reunited with his brothers, and we're going to look at how Joseph dealt with his brothers who had sold him into slavery. Genesis 37, Joseph is sold into slavery. Genesis 42, he and his brothers come back together. And as I said, between Genesis 37 and Genesis 42, there's over 20 years that have passed in that short span of chapters. Now, the stage for this story of Joseph's reunion with his brothers is set for us in verses 1 through 5, where it says, "Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, 'Why are you staring at one another?' He said, 'Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place, so that we may live and not die.' Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, 'I am afraid that harm may befall him.' So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also." Now, what are those verses telling us? How did the brothers end up in Egypt, according to those 5 verses? Okay, there's famine. They heard there was food in Egypt. So he's looking at his 11 sons, of course the 12th being Joseph, and says, "What are you doing? There's food in Egypt, get going." And he keeps Benjamin behind because he's afraid Benjamin would suffer some harm on the way. And this is going to become an important part of the stories that we find in these closing chapters of Genesis. So, yeah, right. So, yeah, exactly. 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 That is the scenario here, is just as the brothers are sitting around doing nothing, not really. So, exactly. And I think part of that statement also is just they're not finding a way to solve the problem. So that's when Jacob finally speaks up and says, "I've heard there's grain in Egypt, get going." And he keeps Benjamin behind. Any other questions or comments on verses 1 through 5? Okay. So it's these things that very briefly set the stage for the story that the author of Genesis will go on to tell in verses 6 through 28 of this chapter. And Joseph's brothers arrive in Egypt, and we see how Joseph deals with his brothers. But one thing we find in these verses is that Joseph's brothers do not know they are in the presence of Joseph. Joseph basically hides his identity from them. So we're going to look at these points that the author makes as we go, and we'll just look at the first point that encompasses verses 6 and 7, where we read, "Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said, the place that Pharaoh had put him in, because Joseph knew how to prepare for the famine, and he was the one who was selling the food. So Joseph's brothers are sent to Egypt to buy food. Joseph's who they had to go to. Now, what do Joseph's brothers do as they come into Joseph's presence? They kneel before him. Now, why is that important? What does that recall for us? His dream. Joseph had this dream that his brothers would one day be bowing down before him. Here the dream is coming true. Over 20 years later. Joseph had the dream right before chapter 37. Now the dream has come true. Questions or comments on verse 6? Oh, sorry. For those of you who walked in, we're in Genesis 42 is what we're looking at. So that brings us into verse 7. Now, what does Joseph do when he recognizes his brothers? What's that? That'll be later in Genesis, but we're here in chapter 42. We see how Joseph, he acted like a stranger. Yeah. He disguised himself so he wouldn't recognize them. And he spoke harsh to them. So Joseph's able to recognize his brothers, but he hides his identity. And he treats them in a harsh manner. Now, the text doesn't tell us why, but one commentator suggests that one possible reason that Joseph does this is because he wanted to see if his recognitions of his brothers was correct. But he does so without giving them any idea that this is Joseph they're dealing with. So again, but point being, we cannot be certain why Joseph treats them in a harsh manner, but what we're going to see is Joseph is going to really test them in a certain way. Sandy? Yeah, Joseph may have that in mind, but Joseph is of a certain character, so he has a very specific reason for doing this, which again the text does not state for us. Maybe, but yeah, they might be feeling each other out. But that's what brings us into verse 7. He asks them, "Where have you come from?" And they respond, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Joseph knows this. He knows exactly where they're coming from, but again, he's, as Andrea put it, feeling out the situation. So that's part of the reason, at least we can assume, that he does not reveal his identity. But we're looking at Joseph's dealings with his brothers, and so here the point seems to be made that he's treating them harshly. But again, we cannot be sure as to why. Anything else on verses 6 and 7? Probably, because the stream was very stuck in his mind when, at least when we studied it, because it happened twice. Exactly. Right. And well, Rebecca had died even before the dream occurred. So yes, she has passed away. But when we're going to see in these closing chapters of Genesis is Joseph is going to ask questions without revealing his identity, trying to find out more about his father, and not to mention his brother Benjamin. That's actually what we're going to talk about next class because I was working on that yesterday. What's that, Andrea? I don't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and check on that. Anything else in verses 6 and 7? Okay. So that brings us into point number 2, where we begin to emphasize the fact that Joseph recognized his brothers, verses 8 through 13. It says, "But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, 'You are spies. You have come to look at the undefended parts of our land.' Then they said to him, 'No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies.' Yet he said to them, 'No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land.' But they said, 'Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive.'" We'll pause there. So verse 8 establishes the point for us. Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. This is a point that's already been made in verse 7. So what this tells us is that the fact that Joseph's brothers did not recognize him, it's really a point of emphasis in this story. Now, since it is a point of emphasis, what the author seems to be showing here is that Joseph, he really had an advantage over his brothers, and that he would be able to deal with them as he saw fit, without them knowing it was Joseph that they were dealing with. Questions or comments on verse 8? So this brings us into verse 9. What does verse 9 tell us? That's He remembered the dreams. That was already said once today. Yeah, for those who just walked in, we're in Genesis 42. So Joseph remembers these dreams. Again, this is over 20 years later. He sees what's going on. He remembers the dreams. But what does he say? He accuses them of being spies. And according to Joseph, what is their intention? To spy out the unprotected parts of Egypt. Now again, Joseph knows what he's doing here. This isn't true at all. Joseph has a very specific purpose for doing this. So, the accusation Joseph makes of his brothers here, they've come to Egypt, they've come to spy out the land. Now, again, Joseph does not necessarily believe this to be true, but he's making it to gain a further advantage over his brothers. He has the upper hand here because he knows his brothers, he knows who they are. They don't know who he is at this point. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. So, how do the brothers respond in verse 10? We're servants and we've come to buy food. Now, how do they address Joseph? What do they call him? My Lord. What does that mean? It's a term of respect. They're not worshiping him as God. It's just a term of respect. When you see that word Lord both in the Old and the New Testament, it's not always our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It's just a term of respect. It's the equivalent of our word sir today. Well, yeah, that's true. And our translators recognize that, so that's why it is lowercase l. So they're just denying the fact that they're spies. They're saying, Lord, sir, we're just here to buy food. And they're being honest about it. So continuing with that response in verse 11, they go on to give some information about themselves. We are all sons of one man. They're honest men. They're here to serve and not to spy out the land. So with that in mind, what the brothers are attempting to do here is win Joseph's favor. They don't want to dig a hole for themselves in all this. And no pun intended. Yeah, that's true. So that's a good point. So questions or comments on verses 10 and 11? So, all the same, what does Joseph do in verse 12? Exactly. He makes the accusation. He's not backing down from this accusation. But what we can assume is he's doing these things to gain an advantage over his brothers, to really test them. And we're going to really see this as we get further into the chapter. So he's preparing them and again testing them for what is going to happen in these coming verses. So, with all that being true, in verse 13, the brothers respond once again to the accusation. I'll just read it again. It says, "But they said, 'Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive.'" Now, what are some observations you make of these verses about their family history that they give here? Okay. Okay, they are counting him as being part of their family, but what are they implying or suggesting about Joseph's situation? They assume he's dead. Okay, so you have it in the past tense. That's interesting. Because the American Standard has it in the present tense. So the point's still the same though, whether it's in the past or the present tense, is they're telling their family history. Where we are, 12 brothers in all. One is not with us, the youngest, and one is dead. So yes, they're assuming Joseph is dead. Go ahead, Elaine. Questions or comments on that verse, on verse 13? Okay, so we put verses 8 through 13 together. What the author is really emphasizing here is that Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize Joseph. So what Joseph does with his brothers is treat them in a way that they could not know that this is Joseph they're dealing with. Joseph is holding back a lot. And it'll be in a couple of chapters that Joseph will reveal who he is. In other words, what Joseph is doing here is treating his brothers as any Egyptian might treat somebody coming from a foreign land. An attitude of harshness and accusation. Go ahead, Elaine. Right, exactly. Since Joseph, and that wasn't going to bring that point up unless it came up. But yes, Joseph would have been dressed in a very specific manner. If you know anything about Egyptian history and seen pictures, you've seen the way they dress. Joseph would have been dressed like an Egyptian. He would look nothing like a Hebrew in the way he would have been dressed in his appearance. And he does this intentionally. The text has earlier said he disguised himself. He made himself look as much like an Egyptian as he possibly could to avoid his brothers recognizing him. And he did this for a purpose. Did you have something, Dean? He could have created problems for himself, possibly, if he didn't follow, lack of a better term, Egyptian protocol. So, yeah, right, right. He would have been very clean cut, using our words today. Um, and Pharaoh, when he put him in this position, he told Joseph, the only thing you're going to be second is to the throne. Joseph had the full authority of Pharaoh, except for the throne, as Pharaoh put it when he put him in this position. Anything else before we get to the final section of this story? Okay. Verses 14 through 28, where we're going to spend the most time today. Says Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh surely you are spies." So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Now Joseph said to them on the third day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you will not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us." Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood." They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them and wept. But when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, and to restore every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. As one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Then he said to his brothers, "My money has been returned, and behold, it is even in my sack." And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" So it's at this point in these verses where we see the fact that Joseph is testing his brothers. And that's the point we're going to be looking at. So what happens in verse 14? What does Joseph say? "You are spies." The third time he's making this accusation. "No, you are spies." So Joseph is insisting upon this fact. Now, from the context, one reason Joseph seems to be insisting upon this fact is not only to test his brothers, but also because of what we learn in verse 21 of this chapter, that his brothers rejected their pleas from Joseph when they tossed him into the pit in chapter 37. So, if that's the case, Joseph is doing the same thing that his brothers did to him, rejecting a plea. Now, as a result of these things, Joseph tests his brothers in verse 15. Now, what's the test that Joseph puts forth in verse 15? They have to bring back their youngest brother. So, he's testing their honesty. This is part of this. So, the idea here is if you're honest men, bring back your youngest brother that you talked about. So, in addition to that, what Joseph was going to do, as verse 16 will indicate, is doing just that, testing the honesty. Now, are there any other reasons that Joseph would do this? If any. He wanted them together. Joseph had a great fondness for Benjamin. So what he seems to be doing is he wants to see is Benjamin still alive and find out how's he doing. Now that will extend out to Jacob, as we'll see in later chapters, but right now it's all about Benjamin. So with that in mind, in verse 16, what does Joseph demand? What's going to happen while the youngest brother is being brought back? Okay, he says, the rest of them are going to stay there. They're going to be confined, basically imprisoned. So this refers to the fact that Joseph was going to test the honesty of their brothers by sending one of them to get the youngest, Benjamin, and the rest remain in prison. But he frames this as an oath by using this phrase, "by the life of Pharaoh." It's using Pharaoh's name to make an oath about something. In this case, Pharaoh's name is being used to say that it would be confirmed that Joseph's brothers were spies if their words turned out not to be true. Questions or comments on that? What's that, Dean? Exactly. You had to be honest and make sure you were telling the truth because it would make life harder for you if you weren't. So in verse 17, we find the fact of the imprisonment. All the brothers except one, no, actually it was all the brothers, 11, were put together in prison for 3 days. No one has left yet to get Benjamin. What Joseph does is just put them all together in prison for 3 days. Now, so with that in mind, what we should also understand here is that since this was a test, verse 19 indicates that all the brothers but one would be allowed to return home. In other words, the plan's going to change. Now, since that's true, it's unclear as to why Joseph put his brothers in prison for a 3-day period. But one possible reason Joseph does this before one goes back is to give them time to decide who's going to make the return journey to Canaan. So he's giving them time to think about things. Now that's what brings us into verses 18 through 20. The brothers have been in prison for 3 days. Joseph comes back, and he changes the conditions of the test. He's still testing their honesty, but what's the change he makes? Okay, he brings God into the discussion. We see that in verse 18. That's an important part of this, but what else does he do? He decides to let all of them go back except for one. Now, yes, this does begin with the statement, do this and live, for I fear God. So he's helping his brothers to realize, at least what seems to be going on, is that's because of his relationship with God that he's changing the terms of this test. And he's treating them better than they deserved. Now, if that's what Joseph is doing, him doing this would cause his brothers to reflect on their own actions, which brought Joseph to Egypt in the first place. Questions or comments on 18 through 20? Yeah, that might also be true, because he would be giving them a pretty substantial amount of grain. Anything else before we get to verse 21? Okay. So what happens in verse 21? Okay, yeah, that guilt kicks in. It says, and they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen, therefore this distress has come upon us. So why are they feeling the guilt according to the language of verse 21? They did not listen. This lends to the idea that when they threw him in the pit, Joseph was pleading, get me out of here. They did not listen. So, furthermore, because Joseph had invoked the authority of God at this point, what may also be happening here is that the brothers are saying that their present situation is God issuing judgment on them for treating Joseph in the way that they did. Questions or comments on verse 21? Okay, so verse 22, we find a statement from Reuben. What does Reuben say? In verse 22. Did I not tell you to sin against him? What else does he say? But you wouldn't listen, and what's the end of the verse there? An accounting, a reckoning of his blood that the American Standard uses. So yeah, Reuben's basically saying, I told you do not do this to Joseph, but because we have, we're now paying for it. And it uses this word reckoning in the New American Standard, or accounting is another word you might have there. Required? Okay. That's an important part of this verse, but The point Reuben is making here is you didn't listen to me when I told you don't do anything to the boy. And we saw that in chapter 37. Reuben protests throwing Joseph into the pit, and he did so with the ultimate intention of returning Joseph to his father. But the brothers didn't listen, so Reuben says the reckoning, the accounting, or his blood, the blood requirement is coming back on us. Now this concept there at the end of the verse, it's a concept that refers to the fact that vengeance is being taken on blood that was previously shed. And so this word reckoning, whatever translation you have, it comes from a word that could be translated as accounting. In other words, it refers to someone being held accountable for something that has been done. Applied here, Reuben, what Reuben says here, has to do with the fact that he believes he and his brothers are now being held accountable by God for what they had done to Joseph. And so with Reuben having said this, the author will go on to verse 23 to record something else. But before we get there, anything on Reuben's statement? That might have crossed their mind. That maybe God's going to kill us for all this, but the text doesn't tell us. So, going on into verse 23, what does the author of Genesis record for us? Exactly. They don't know this is Joseph they're dealing with, but Joseph's hearing all these things. He speaks their language, but they don't know. The interpreter part, I'm glad you brought that up. Since they were speaking amongst themselves, the interpreter probably would not be interpreting these things for Joseph because they're just talking to themselves. That's a good question to ask. But Joseph still understood because he speaks their language. So our sinful nature. So same reason we all do. Yeah. That's true. Anything else on verse 23? Right. It's part of the ruse, we might say. So exactly. That's right. So that's another way to look at it. So so how does Joseph respond? He's understood what they've said. So what does Joseph do in verse 24? Turned away and wept, cried basically. So, but he turns away. He does not let his brothers see this because he's still trying to avoid recognition. But he comes back, and what does he do? He took Simeon. Now, something we should know about Simeon is he's the second oldest of the brothers. Reuben's the oldest. Simeon is the second oldest. We have to ask the question, I'm going to ask it of you, why does he choose Simeon? It was a group effort, but I don't remember exactly what Simeon's role was in all of this. Okay. Exactly. We have to keep verse 23 in mind. This tells us that one possible reason that Joseph chose Simeon to tie up is because he knew Reuben was trying to prevent the problem that brought Joseph to Egypt in the first place. So again, these are just possible reasons we can suggest. The text doesn't tell us for sure. All we know is that he chose Simeon over Reuben or any of the other brothers. So having done these things, what does Joseph do next in verse 25? Okay, that was verse 24. Well, what does verse 25 tell us? Fill their sacks and give them provisions to leave. What else? What does he give them, though, in addition, as part of these provisions? He put the money back in their sacks. He has sold them this food, but he returns the money. Now, this is beginning to bring to a close this part of the story of Joseph's dealings with his brothers. He gives the orders, give them the grain, put the money back in their sacks. He's taking on a benevolent attitude toward his brothers because he's taking nothing from them. He's giving them everything they need for a successful journey. Sandy? And we see that in part of the story later is he sets up that accusation, and that's what the brothers are going to come to believe. Um, right. And they're going to have to go back because they're following orders of this test. Anything else before we get to the closing verses? Okay. So, verses 26 through 28, this part of the story comes to a close by recording, with the author recording what happened with the brothers after Joseph did what he did in verse 25. Now, as we read this section of the story, the point of emphasis seems to be that the brothers are really surprised that the money has been returned to them. So, with that in mind, what's the response we find in verse 28 of the brothers? Right. The text says there in verse 28, then he said to his brothers, my money has been returned, and behold, it is even in my sack, and their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? So they're fearful. They think they're going to look like thieves. And so they still see this as God bringing judgment upon them. It's Reuben's already said this once, the reckoning of the blood. Exactly. Exactly. This has been 20 years in the making, 20 plus. But this was all part of this test that Joseph was performing upon them to get them to reflect on their own actions, and it was a test of their honesty, as we've already seen. So, putting verses 14 through 28 together, the point we should see is that Joseph tested his brothers. And the author of Genesis has shown that after first encountering his brothers, Joseph tested them because he knew they didn't recognize him. But ultimately, again, what Joseph was testing in them was their honesty. He was testing their character. And this is seen in the fact that the response of their brothers to this test was an admission of guilt toward what they had done to Joseph, and an admission that they began to wonder, is God bringing judgment upon us after all these years, after what they'd done in chapter 37. So, we're looking at Joseph's dealing with his brothers. So when you put verses 1 through 28 under that point, the point we should be left with is that Joseph dealt with his brothers in a way that would ultimately bring them closer to the Lord. He treated them harshly. He recognized his brothers. He tested his brothers. Now, how does that bring them closer to the Lord? It helps bring them closer to the Lord because it would help them to realize that what they did was a sin against God in doing what they did to Joseph. So with that being the case, the application of this story to us, at least one application, is that we too must deal with each other in a way that brings us closer to the Lord. Now, based on what we read in these verses, sometimes bringing each other closer to the Lord means we might have to treat each other very harshly, using the language of the text, but it has to come from a place of love, doing that strong rebuke. Another way we bring each other closer to the Lord is by taking time to recognize the need to bring each other closer to the Lord. And finally, a third way we can bring each other closer to the Lord is by testing each other's character and by giving each other opportunities to prove our character as followers of the Lord. I've given you a lot of information to chew on today. Any other questions or comments? Alrighty. Jeremiah, would you close us today?